other things that may fall into the pain category. Untreated medical issues, inadequate shelter, food insecurity, domestic violence, labor exploitation, lack of access to health care, family separation, unresolved legal status, gridlock in the resettlement program, xenophobia, discrimination. The most important thing we have learned through spending hundreds of hours with clients is to focus on the pain that is in front of us before focusing on the legal case. If our client is sleeping in the cemetery, we can't interview him about the torture he suffered in his country. If he has gone without food for days, we can't open up memories of beatings or electric shock. We have to create a protection plan. So what does a holistic protection plan look like? I want to share through a series of case studies some examples of holistic care and rehabilitation in our project. I have 5 really brief cases, and then maybe we can spend some time grappling with some questions. I've talked for about 25 minutes, I think, so far. These cases are ones that we have. I'm not using client photos for confidentiality reasons, but I'll tell you about the cases. I have permission, by the way, for any photos that I use, I have permission. Any quotes that I use, I have consent from clients to use those quotes. I think it's very important as advocates that we always acknowledge that and that we always get that consent. But I'm not using photos in these cases because these are victims of torture, and it's a privacy and confidentiality issue. They're also active cases. So in this picture, I'm going off notes, which is a relief for me. I'm sure it's a relief for you. In this picture, you'll see an artist doing pottery and ceramic work. So this client is a teenager. She was referred to us in the Middle East by a torture rehabilitation program, Center for Victims of Torture. She had just been released from the hospital. She had just attempted suicide. She's from Sudan. She was living with her family, and her family had fled Sudan. Several members of the family had suffered sexual violence. And they were living in the country where we had our project. And they were in a really difficult housing situation. Their shelter was in a dangerous area. And every time this teenage girl would go outside, she would be subjected to, she was a beautiful girl, and she would be subjected to harassment and abuse and threats of abuse by people in the neighborhood. And this would re-trigger her. Every time she went outside, it would re-trigger the trauma that she had suffered in her country. And so she finally just lost hope. The other thing that happened is her brother, who was a victim of sexual violence, had had an interview for refugee resettlement, and he could not disclose what happened to him because it was too traumatic. The officer interviewing him was a woman. He felt too ashamed, and so he didn't disclose, so he was denied resettlement. So she has 2 things going on. She has the re-triggering and re-trauma every time she leaves their home, which is unstable and unfinished. And she has the fear that she's going to be separated from her brother, who's been denied protection. And so she decides that she's going to end her life. And then her case is referred to us. Why was her case referred to us? Because in our project, the first thing we do is we stabilize a family. I would never conduct a legal interview in this situation. The first thing we did is we moved the entire family into safe housing so that they could be together. She was no longer at risk. She was no longer at risk of violence in the community where they were living. The next thing I did is I interviewed the parents in the family, a beautiful older couple who had managed to get their entire family, a unit, moved from Sudan to the country where we were working. And I got a basic sketch of what had happened in their history. I didn't go deep in that interview. One of the things lawyers tend to do is they want to go right into the story of what happened to you. What did you experience? Tell me about the torture. We never do that. I never permit our teams to do that. We stabilize, and if anything, we get a skeleton understanding of what happened to that family. And then we start the rebuilding process. Who needs access to medical care? Which kids aren't in school? Do you have enough food? Is there food security? Does mom have a medical issue that has the whole family preoccupied? And we address that entire cluster of issues. This is not a race. Doing torture cases can take years. And if you do race, you lose the case. We restabilize that family in terms of just some basic life necessities that we all have. And then, one by one, we began interviewing the members of the family to try and comprehend the deeper layers of their story. Why the art? Because in the course of interviewing the teenage girl, we didn't say, tell me what happened to you in Sudan. We said, tell me about your childhood. Tell me about your life growing up. What was your favorite class in school? What did you study? What brings you happiness? And it's difficult. Those conversations can be as painful as talking about torture because it reminds them of what they've lost. And yet you go slowly, slowly. In Arabic, the word is shway shway. You go slowly, slowly into those areas to try and find safe territory where you can begin to make a relationship and build trust with your client. So we learned that she loved art. We learned that art was her form of expression. And so we created art programs for her. We took her to do art. And she suddenly began to come out of her depression. We, of course, I want to emphasize, she was having professional mental health care from the day we met her. I think that's imperative, and I think it's critical that we always support our cases with professional medical care, with psychologists who can help, can prescribe medication appropriately if necessary, or they can withdraw someone from medication if they're over-medicated. These are skills that lawyers don't have, and we have to honor the fact that there are professionals. Sometimes we have to pay for them, but there are professionals who can help us with that. So she eventually became the creative art director of our project, working with other refugees, helping other refugees to draw out of their fear and anxiety and depression. Her case is still pending, but we have a strategy in her case for the entire family. The other rule that we have for our cases is we will not separate families. So one of the other legal aid groups had said, well, we can sort of get this whole family of women on track for resettlement, but your brother's going to have to stay behind. Well, that's not a legal strategy in my view. We're not going to separate families and create lifelong trauma by having brother stay behind when the rest of the family goes ahead. And so we have to be creative and thoughtful and frankly rebuild that brother's case and explain why he had not been able to disclose. So I guess this case for me illustrates looks like. Sorry, I'm struggling with this mic. Here's another case. I might want to do two of these. Three. So this is a cheesemaker. And he certainly didn't introduce himself as a cheesemaker. He came to us. He was another case where he had attempted suicide. He was experiencing all of the symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. He was not sleeping. He was suffering grave depression. He had physical symptoms of pain and suffering from the torture he had experienced. He was completely disconnected from his family, unable to be a father to his children, unable to support his wife, who was also traumatized. He came into our project. What's happening with this individual and also with his family, because it's a unit. I think I'm going to get some help with my microphone right now. Sorry, let me just pause for a second. Should I take that off? No, I'm going to try with this one. It's going to be a little challenging if I have to go back to my notes and both hold a microphone and read from my notes, but we'll see how that goes. So what did we do? We did the same thing in this case that we had done in our other cases. First, housing. Where are they living? We do home visits in our cases. We do have an office. Everywhere we work, we have offices in confidential spaces. Greece is challenging because we work in camps, but other places we have offices. But we do home visits so we can understand what's going on in this family life. You can see a lot in a home visit. First of all, you see just the physical structure of where they're living. Is there mold on the walls? Are the children safe? Is it in a violent area? Are there shootings at night? All these things that can re-traumatize a family, put people at risk. But you can also see the dynamics in the family. You can see the relationships. You can see the children. You can tell if people are connected and functioning as a family, or if they're disconnected and still suffering a really acute phase of trauma. And then what do you do with that? You bring in resources. You bring in the medical experts, the psychologists, the child protection officers, not in a threatening way, not in a way that would put the family in jeopardy, but in a way to add that additional support. A lot of times children who are in refugee families are not in school. It's not always because of access. Sometimes it's not accessible. Sometimes it's because the family is too traumatized to go register the child in school. Sometimes it's because they're afraid to be separated from their children and they want to keep their children at home with them. So we have to work with that issue too. That's a part of the holistic care plan. It's good for children to be in school, especially if their parents are traumatized, because it gives children healthy environments where they can be safe and play and have activities and return to normal childhoods. But it takes time. It takes building trust with the family to develop that kind of relationship. So in this case, we did all of that. We got access to medical care, psychological care, made sure they had safe shelter, made sure the kids were in school, and began to develop a relationship with the father of the family who was a victim of torture. So what did we do? We talked about his past life, what his profession was, what his source of livelihood was, what he had done before the war began and before he had experienced his torture. His father was a chief. This is how this came up. I asked him if he could think of one peaceful memory from his past. And he thought for a minute, and he said, I remember when I was a little boy, I was standing on a stool, and I was helping my father make cheese. And it was such a pretty image. And I said, why were you helping your father make cheese? My father was a cheesemaker. He was the cheesemaker in our village. I learned that he knows how to make 60 kinds of cheese. He had been an apprentice to his father and become a cheesemaker, and he knew how to make 60 kinds of cheese. So guess what we did? We made cheese. That's part of holistic rehabilitation. It's helping him to regain and rebuild that inner structure to his life. It allowed him, for even just one day, to be able to get out of that suffocating environment of pain and poverty and trauma and make cheese. And he now is the official cheesemaker in our project. So he has an identity. We continue to work with him. We have a resettlement plan for him and his family. This woman was a productive gardener in her country before she was displaced by war and trauma. So she entered a gardening competition. Look how huge her plant is. So again, it was stability through all of the holistic care and wraparound support and housing and child care, but finding what it is that makes her heart beat. This young man, it's the last case I'll talk about, and then maybe we can pause. I have just a couple more comments. This young man had been living in an area in Syria during the war that was heavily bombed. And so he assigned himself, he was alone there as a teenager. His family had already fled and he had stayed behind. So he assigned himself the role of taking all the injured children from the bombings to the hospital. He would carry all the kids. Some of them didn't survive, but every child that was injured he would carry to the hospital. Well, this put him on the radar with the regime because they said, you're supporting the opposition by helping all of these children. So he was imprisoned. I'm using his photo with his permission. So he was imprisoned and he was tortured. He stayed in Syria until the third time he was imprisoned, and finally he fled because he didn't think he was going to live. So he fled and came into our project, and he was absolutely shattered. One of the issues that happened with him is he felt so guilty that he had left. He felt so guilty that there were still children where he had left in his village, and he wasn't there helping them. So we worked with him for a long time to make sure that he was safe, to give him an opportunity to heal. But we also eventually helped him to connect with children in our project, and we eventually made him the child advocate of our project in a way that he could advocate for refugee children who were displaced, so he could still serve, he could still help, he could still tap in to that core sense of humanity that he had. And that has helped him to come out. You can see him smiling here. That has helped him to come out of this deep despair that he felt as a result of his experiences. This is the guy who was living in the cemetery. We use theater in our project as well. And so he had, lo and behold, little did we know until we got to know him, a theater background. And so we connected him with a theater group in the country where we were working. And he's doing very well. He has an apartment provided by our project. He's safe, he has food, long access to mental health care to support him and help him to feel less isolated and less afraid. But again, using theater as a tool for healing and recovery. Okay, so I'm almost done. So why did these clients start on the path to healing from torture? And I'm just going to sort of summarize. The first reason is that all of them had their immediate safety needs met. We committed to providing shelter and food for them until they became self-sufficient. This is an expensive, ambitious, and somewhat intimidating commitment, but we felt it was required in order to build a baseline of stability in each case. The second reason is that we allowed our relationship with these clients to develop over multiple interviews over a period of years. We got to know them as individuals before we began probing their histories. This brought them a sense of value and tapped into a part of their core identity that was empowering and full of light. The third reason is that we allowed them to reveal their histories to us slowly over time, and only when it was necessary for a legal purpose. We allowed them to control the pace and depth of interviews. We explained in detail why we needed to go into depth and how the process would unfold and how we would use the information they provided to us. Fourth, we worked with doctors and medical professionals trained to support victims of torture, and we provided medical accompaniment to be sure they felt safe. In one of our most challenging cases, one of our clients suffered a breakdown after learning extremists had beheaded his best friend. This triggered memories of his own torture, and he developed symptoms of psychosis. He began hallucinating, and he developed delusions of members of the militia trying to harm him. He thought everyone in his community was a member of this group. In that case, we had to pay for private psychiatric care to help him become stable. We stayed at the hospital with him for a full month, providing constant support, interpreter capacity, language capacity, and working with the doctors who were treating him. He did recover. He was able to recover. But for our holistic model, he may not have survived. Lastly, we gave each client the chance to reach back and help others who were hurt. Our child advocate began caring for children while we conducted interviews with their parents. Our artist began teaching other refugees her craft of art. In this way, clients were able to draw on their own experiences and gifts to show others that healing is possible. If I leave you with one thought from today, it is that healing is possible. What strikes me most when I first meet a victim of torture who has not had access to rehabilitation is the deep well of darkness in which they are trapped. It is as if the light that exists within all of us has been extinguished in them. I always tell them, this light is still there inside of them. It is a matter of uncovering it, of protecting it, of nurturing it back to its fullness. I was recently with a client and we talked about this light. During our first meeting, I had asked him how much light he felt was still inside of him after what he had suffered. He showed me the tip of his index finger, and he said this much. A few months later, I asked him again. He said the light had traveled up one arm and reached his shoulder. Most recently, I asked him how much light he felt he had uncovered in the year we had known each other. He spread his arms open and smiled an amazing, trusting smile. I feel this much, he said. It is not always there, but today I feel it. And this is the way it is. It isn't always visible, but the light is always there. Thanks. So I think the plan was that we were going to do questions.
Yes, we will have time for just a few brief questions. So if anyone has any comments to make or questions, Jane will be back for an interdisciplinary conversation this afternoon where you will have more of a chance to interact with her and ask her more questions. But we do have a few minutes now, so if we can take maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor.
Sometimes when I do these talks, first of all, I regret reading as much as I did, and I apologize for that, but it's really difficult to try and convey as much information as I want to convey and make sure that I share refugee testimonies, because I think it's so critical that we hear their words. But the other thing is that these are heartbreaking, alarming, sad stories. And sometimes we just have utter silence at the end of a discussion like this, because it's just an enormous amount to process. So if there are no questions, it's okay. But if there are, I'd be happy to address them as well. And we have two. Let's go here and then here. Yep.
All right, I thought that was really powerful testimony. So I just had two questions. The first one is, it sounds like for this holistic process, you'd require quite a number of resources and have to be quite selective, and it sounds like you're getting referred perhaps like the most traumatized people from maybe the main processing center. So I just wondered how that worked, like whether you train them up to look for symptoms and so forth. And I'm too traumatized to remember my second question, so that'll help you for now.
So the question is, how do we select our cases? They're resource intensive for sure. It certainly costs a lot of money to provide the kind of support that we do, especially if we have to engage private medical care, which in some countries is necessary because resources are so stretched to the limit for refugee health care. What I always tell the referring organizations in the countries where we work with partner organizations is, if you have a case where you think the person may not survive and you don't know where to send that case, send it to us. There are many, many, many cases like that. There are many cases where refugees are at risk of suicide, or they're separated from their families and have catastrophic things going on. But then the agency will choose their cases, and they'll send us the one where the woman was just released from the hospital, or they'll send us the one where someone is suffering from psychosis and threatening to kill their children. We get those cases. And the reason I ask for those cases is because we do have those resources. My mom passed away in 2010. She was a humanitarian, she was a poet, and I set up a foundation in her memory. And so I raise funds from around the world, and I use all of the funds that we raise to support our projects in the field. So the funds aren't coming from the law firm. The free legal services come from the law firm. The funds for the other care that we provide come from the foundation. And it's costly, but I also always feel that we've been able to find resources when we need them. So, we don't have a sort of checklist of they have to meet these requirements. We have no nationality requirement. It can be anyone from anywhere in the world. We have no requirement. The one requirement I would say we have is that someone in the family is a victim of torture. And that's because we have expertise in that area. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, what proportion of your cases you deal with relate to gender-based violence?
It's a good question, because it's a sub-area of expertise within the area of working with victims of torture. In Haiti, 100%. We had a project in Haiti for 5 years, and I didn't talk about outcomes in our cases. In Haiti, we were able to relocate 200. The Convention Against Torture has not been ratified in Haiti. There's very little recourse for rehabilitation or redress in Haiti. So our strategy in that context was to relocate victims of torture, victims of sexual violence, from Haiti to Canada, where they could obtain services that they needed, because there also were not adequate medical services in Haiti. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And so in that case, we evacuated, essentially resettled 250 individuals from Haiti to Canada, and those people are now living there and have status and have been able to recover and heal from trauma. So in Haiti, it was 100% sexual gender-based violence. In the Middle East, it's quite high. I would say at least a third of our cases involve sexual gender-based violence. Sexual violence in prisons by the regime, sexual violence in Iraq. We've worked in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and dealt with cases involving threatened honor killing after women have suffered sexual violence and then have been at risk of honor killing by members of their families. So it's a high percentage, I'd say about a third. But definitely one of the most vulnerable populations that we work with are young men of military age. It's a category that a lot of people don't want to work with because they're accused of all kinds of bad things, like being associated with possible terrorist groups. But we work with that population and we understand their stories and we uncover their histories and we implement protection strategies because they really are desperately vulnerable. Had one kid one time who just broke down during an interview and he said, "I just want to be with my mother." He was a teenager. And I said to my interpreter later in the day, I said, "You know, these guys don't need a lawyer. They need a mom. That's what they need." Thanks.
Okay, just one last question. Two. I'll wrap it up with the two questions that I see hands up. And if you press the little button right next to your mic, you'll turn it on. Yeah.
Okay. My name is I'm coming from Thailand. Our context is in the conflict in the deep south, where people, the survivors are still facing everyday threat for being arrested, for capture again, and being in the same detentions, and the whole family also experience multiple experience of torture sessions. It seems like all these cases have been privileged to have moved or shifting from one environment to another environment. Do you have any thought about how would it, in the different contexts?
So I guess your question is, how can you possibly implement a protection strategy when, the person that you're trying to support is still at risk of daily violence? I mean, this is not analogous, but the closest analogy I can come up with is Haiti, because we were dealing with internally displaced populations who were still at risk, and many had been subjected to generations of violence and had not been able to flee or find protection. And so we went into that country and we developed a legal aid program where our whole goal was to try and stabilize within the country. You could also arguably try and build capacity within the country to try and address the issue within, but that's very difficult, and obviously it takes decades to build that kind of capacity. But you're right. Most of the people that we're working with in Europe and in the Middle East have left the place where the harm occurred. But it doesn't mean that the harm isn't still occurring. Re-victimization is actually quite prevalent, especially in countries where they don't have status. And so there may be a border country where they fled to, but they don't have status. This is certainly true with Afghan refugees in particular. And they continue to be subjected to violence and exploitation and detention and imprisonment and beings in prison. And how do you heal when every day the wound is reopened? And the only thing I can say is, for us, we keep our projects really small. We're not trying to change the world. We're trying to help one person. And so if we think of it that way, maybe there are ways to develop protection plans for that individual or that neighborhood or that community, and just kind of hammer away at it. But I wish I had a better answer than that.
Okay, and we had one last question from the gentleman there.
Thank you so much. My personal experience, speaking from the perspective of the victim, I say the hardest part of the whole thing is for the victims to prove their cases. And reason being maybe because most of these human rights abuses happen in places where there is a system and institutional breakdown, where it's really difficult to come up with empirical evidences. And above all is that the perpetrators themselves do a lot to destroy whatever would be any evidence. And I think there's still a huge gap. I appreciate you've given some of the efforts or the strategies like using the medical professionals and so forth. Do you still see a gap and a lot of work to do in terms of inducing the evidences to prove these cases?
Yeah, I think in 90% of cases we don't have evidence, and that might even be a low statistic. First of all, I'm really sorry about your experience, and I'm really glad that you're here today to participate and to support the symposium. But definitely, I think that evidence gathering and developing evidence and even evidence on country conditions is challenging, because a lot of times what we read in the news is not what's going on in the country. It's been distorted in such a way that you might have a credible claim from the person sitting in front of you, and you simply can't find the material evidence to support that claim. And I think testimony becomes critical. Working with lawyers who can help elicit that testimony becomes critical. I think working with doctors who can help corroborate that testimony, certainly forensic experts, if there are physical aspects to torture, forensic medical experts who can say this type of injury is consistent with his testimony about what happened, can help. But there's absolutely no question that there's a massive gap in terms of resource. And, you know, I think we just have to keep working away at it. Our project is tiny compared to the need. And as I said, I think we just have to keep having symposiums like this and collaborating among professions. So thanks for your question.
Okay. All right, thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you very much, Jane, for your thoughts this morning. Some of it's uncomfortable, and also hopeful, but certainly thought-provoking and inspirational the whole way through. So if we can all just show Jane our appreciation, and she'll be around for the weekend as well, just to discuss any other questions you may have. So thank you, Jane. And now we have Dr. Nathan, who will be giving us some insight into how it works in Hong Kong and taking a Hong Kong perspective when it comes to medical treatment and holistic rehabilitation in Hong Kong. Dr. Fan sits on the board of MSF Hong Kong, and he is also a co-founder and chairman of Health in Action, which is an organization in Hong Kong that assists asylum seekers, torture survivors, and other persons displaced access healthcare. And Dr. Fan also produces medical legal reports to help document torture and assist in asylum claims in Hong Kong as well. So we're very pleased and privileged to have him here address us today.
I just briefly talk about my background is I'm working in the public sector in hospital authority as a surgeon. And last night I have been tortured by my nurse. But fortunately I still can come. I've been working with MSF before and have been to Jane to Haiti, Gaza, Libya, Sri Lanka, and some other places, and which have inspired me to think about crime. Because at one go, when I was in Philippines slum, I approached a bishop, and I said that in this slum, in the courtyard, maybe we should do something for the people. And he said, you better go to the other place, but not in this graveyard, because they are criminals. And this made me feel what is crime. And so I've been studying in Hong Kong U, fortunately accept me criminology. And then later I think about migrant health and about other things that I observe in Hong Kong. And I take the point of view of organizing a new organization by myself, Health in Action, which is mainly is trying to use the model of service, evidence, and then advocacy, a cycle, try to do some advocacy. And this is why I've been engaged with Justice Center as a kind of collaboration. So a quick summary is in Hong Kong in 2012 when I first really understand about refugees, asylum seekers in Hong Kong. There have been 6,000 torture claim people in Hong Kong. And up to this year, it is estimated to be more than 10,000. And Hong Kong is a place where the screening process is very slow. And it has been changed over the years. I will not go into detail. But the point is the recognition rate is super low, less than 2%. Sorry, less than 1%. And the place where they can go finally as a destiny is only US and Canada. And the quota is also in terms of around 100. So there's a snowball effect that a lot of people is being locked here. And I've seen some torture claim people have been in Hong Kong for over 8 years. So what happened is they are in a condition of social exclusion. Why I say that is that, for example, for housing, they don't have enough financial support to find a house. For example, every one of them only got 2,000. And we all know that in Hong Kong to rent a small place to live is really, really expensive. So some of them, they use a roster to sleep, just like a roster for our health profession is someone sleep in the morning, and then the other come to the bed to sleep in the afternoon, and someone sleep at the night time. And while at the same time, some people will sleep at the stairs at the back. For food, I'll give you a benchmark is for government, they have estimated for people who get Social Security, the minimum to make that person healthy is around $1,800 per month. But the amount of the food coupon that the refugees, asylum seekers, that they can get today per head is only equivalent to 1,200. And mind you, and remind you that the calculation based on government is for an elderly. But most of the people in Hong Kong is young people. So you see there is a gap. And I will focus about the health. On paper, they have the right to go to health facility as an emergency setting. So a lot of people, when they get sick, they will go to emergency department. But I think it's not only Hong Kong, everywhere we all know that in an emergency setting, it's just like another camp. The waiting time is very long, even for local public. And with the language barrier, the cultural difference, and of course, the many frontline staff, even do not know there is refugees in Hong Kong. When we go back to 2012, and they will think they may be disappeared tomorrow. So so we have to use the public resources to help them. This is true for some of the frontline staff because they don't know about the context. So for us, what we are doing is we try to get funding from people, foundation in Hong Kong, and also to get some resources from other countries. We set up a team, a small team, but we are taking the kind of the systemic change mindset to do something. First is we collect data. And the second is we work with other partners to build up a collaboration. And I will show you some of the work. We use the topic on health equity because we believe that health is a topic that no one can escape, even for authority. And health is a topic that the press, the media want to capture, even they are refugees. So we are taking the approach that we try to spread the news on that. Initially, when we get into touch with the refugees, we think, because, as I said, the major service provider in Hong Kong is hospital authority, and they can get into the access at least on paper. So initially we identify psychological problem is the main concern they are facing. But we know that there is also quite difficult to have many psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, counselors in Hong Kong that can serve on that. And while at the same time, we think the psychological problem indeed is because of the social context they are facing in Hong Kong, but not really is a kind of just a simple victimization on that. They are suffering from the secondary victimization. So what we are doing is we build a project, we try to use them as a helper. Because why we call this is because by law, the Hong Kong government even do not allow them to work in any sense, even around here. So we position them to help other NGO in their project, and including us. For example, they help Hong Kong Red Cross to spread humanitarian spirit or knowledge or story about refugees for the youth. They help Hong Kong Red Cross to do fundraising in some booth in the public. We want to put them into the public in any sense to show that they can really do something for the community and they can help. The second is when they face the Hong Kong public directly, they can speak for themselves. And the third is we try to break the social exclusion. Not only see them on the newspaper in a very negative sense. And this is one way we try to handle the psychological stress. And the second is finally about the health access is in two aspects we think there's a problem. First is because in Hong Kong a lot of refugees come from different areas. The major is from South Asia. Second is Southeast Asia. And then we see quite a number from Middle East, including Palestine, Egypt, and Iran, who speak Arabic. And also countries from Africa like Congo, Somalia, Uganda, and some small countries from West Africa. So we think that indeed a lot of the common illness that they are facing do not need to be handled in emergency department. And then we develop a health booklet for them, such that they know how to manage common illness like headache, flu, diarrhea at a home setting. And we develop into different language like Arabic, Swahili, Urdu, different kind of language, and distribute to different NGO who are directly serving them on the social aspect. And the third is we talk to hospital authority about the so-called they have the rights on paper, but in the front line they face the difficulty because the frontline staff do not know about this. And indeed it's a lengthy, difficult talk because we need to gather evidence. And now at the same time we train some ambassadors who are doing the kind of health escort for the asylum seeker in 2013, starting from that. And who are the ambassadors? Is the medical student. Because finally we think medical students should know more about global health, migrant, and have a humanitarian spirit. And because in future they will be the leader. So we collect and develop a university chapter and train them, and they would escort the refugees to see the doctor. Or to do the registration, I would say, before seeing the doctor, because the first barricade is the registration. And when the frontline staff refuse to do registration, they will hand the hospital authority letter stating that they have the right. And no one can argue then. And through this kind of I would say, confrontation, training to other NGO, and also we also develop the kind, because they stay in Hong Kong for 8 years. We are also training some of the ambassadors from the refugees group that they help themselves. They know how to handle this kind of the barricade and try to break through the health access issue. And the third is we call it is a health equity clinic is because we are not trying to become the kind of the volunteer doctor who really seeing the case. Because we think that first is the resources cannot support, and the second is finally is the system issue. So through that, indeed, we try to work with other NGO, is to collect the data and also doing more advocacy. And at the other level, we start to work with the legislative member who are more liberal and open. So finally, we think we try to help in this circle is because we know the context, we know the people. We do more lobbying at the legislative level is to mobilize the resources there to help to change the things, and also at the hospital authority level. I would say now for the medical interpreter service, the hospital authority start a new pilot project in Twin Wound Hospital now is they have in-house interpreter. Because as we all know, for torture claim people, when they go to A&E or when they go to the public setting, they need to get a waiver, as well as maybe some of them need to have the medical interpreter service. For the medical waiver, this is a very long story. I would just to make it short is we are still discussing with Social Welfare Department to give them a 1 month waiver rather than a one-off waiver. Because they need to get the waiver in before they can actually see the doctor. You can imagine it's really impossible at the night time or at some very embarrassing time when the formal office hour is about to close. This is still in progress. But at least the medical interpreter service, we have quite confidence we are still pushing for that, using the health as a kind of topic. So I would say to look into the future, what we can further helping the people in Hong Kong is, I think culturally, we need to do more propaganda. It's very interesting that Hong Kong people donate a lot of money to MSF, to Red Cross, to many, even to UNHCR, to help refugees. But when they see the news that there is refugees in Hong Kong, they get very negative sense. I don't know, press sometimes is really very powerful, even more powerful than lawyer and doctor, to make the image change overnight. But I still think we can do more. For us, we try to do more in the medical sector, at the medical student sector, we try to change that. The other is about the health burden that they are facing. We try to do it as an NGO setting, a lot of people helping them to get into access through the private practitioner setting. It's not that sustainable. Some people propose about so-called refugee clinic, and some other people even propose about we have to have a refugee camp for those politicians. I don't think it is a good idea because it just have some kind of labeling effect and also even further isolate them. I think we have still to tackle the system issue. And the third is, I think for immigration department, we are talking about could we have a welcome package for them, including health. Of course, it's just a very naive idea afterwards. I think they don't welcome them. How can they have a welcome pack? So we changed the strategy is that we try to give the kind of health welcome pack the so-called healthy living booklet we developed to all the NGOs serving them, so that they can know how to, at least how to do some prevention and how to get to the health access. Finally, I still think the right to health topic is good for engagement to the greater society. And my sharing for this short period is just want to say is only one department we cannot get in touch with is the Security Bureau in Hong Kong, because they said they cannot talk about health, they don't know how to talk. But for all the other departments or bureau of government, when you use the topic on health, at least they will reply you through the email and continue the dialogue. And of course, some of them we succeed to have regular meetings, that kind of things. I think together we have to work more together with lawyers, social sector, in order to bring this topic to make Hong Kong change. Because if we start to think about Hong Kong is losing the kind of identity as an international society, we can use that as a kind of topic or dialogue to break through the society myth about the refugees. And I still think we have the responsibility to do that as a kind of Hong Konger, or as a kind of we should have a more global perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fan, for your insight into certainly some of the barriers to healing in Hong Kong. As we're running a little bit behind time, I will invite you to ask any questions that you have for Dr. Fan during the break that we're about to go now. Dr. Fan will be sticking around, so please feel free to discuss and work out what collaborations can come out of this session. Just before we break, I just want to give an idea of what happens after the break. We have 2 breakout sessions, in fact, coming on after break, looking once again at the barriers to protection and looking deeper into the topic of gender-based violence and the complexities that come out of that, and how do we expand the rights for victims of gender-based violence, both in the protection sense and the rehabilitation sense. The other breakout session that we have is on detention expedited procedures, and once again looking at how that is acting as a barrier at the get-go for people trying to access even the start of the rehabilitation process. So have a think of your break as to which one you would like to attend. The gender-based violence breakout session will be on this floor, whereas the other session on detention expedited procedures will be on the second floor in the moot court. So you'll have to go down there and be led that way. And we'll introduce the sessions in more detail. We do come back from the break. As I mentioned, we're a little bit behind. So if you aim to make your way to the breakout session you wish to be at by 11:30, and we will move the schedule to suit. Thank you very much.